Hello YouTube! In this video we're going to look at truth-tracking theories of knowledge and how they deal with the challenge of skepticism. In particular we'll look at a famous proposal from Robert Nozick from his book Philosophical Explanations. So first of all, Nozick proposes a general analysis of knowledge. The skeptic of course denies that we have knowledge, but what exactly is it that the skeptic is denying that we have? Well, in order to know that a proposition is true, we need, at the very least, to have a true belief in the proposition. But most philosophers think that true belief is not enough. If I believe that the butler committed the murder on the basis just of flipping a coin, well, even if my belief is true and the butler did in fact commit the murder, I don't know that the butler committed the murder. Flipping a coin is not a good basis on which to form a belief. So true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. Now, the traditional analysis of knowledge has it that knowledge is justified true belief. So S knows that P, just in case P is true, S believes that P, and S's belief that P is justified. Now, this analysis runs into a classic objection from Edmund Gettier, which is that we can find many cases in which a person has justified true belief, but where we would not attribute knowledge to them. So here's a simple example. Let's say you wake up in the morning, you go downstairs, you look at the clock, and it reads 8 o'clock. So you form the belief that it is 8 o'clock in the morning. Now it is in fact 8 o'clock in the morning, so your belief is true. And it seems that your belief is justified because, generally clocks provide good evidence of the time. But now, suppose that in fact the clock had stopped at 8 p.m. the previous night, and you just happened to look at it at one of the 2 times in the day when it displayed the correct time. Well, in that case, it seems like you don't know that it's 8 o'clock. You have a true belief, you have a justified true belief, but it's not knowledge. So we have these first 2 conditions, P is true and S believes that P. But the question is, what other conditions must be added to yield the correct analysis of knowledge? And this is where Nozick comes in. So he says, what matters for knowledge is not actually having justification, right? Justification it isn't really so relevant. What matters for knowledge is that your belief is connected to the world in the right kind of way. So here is Nozick's analysis of knowledge. S knows that P, just in case. P is true. S believes that P. If P weren't true, S wouldn't believe that P. And if P were true, S would believe that P. The basic idea here is that S knows that P, just in case S has a true belief that varies with the truth. So S uses methods to form her belief such that those methods would lead her to true beliefs, even in different situations. So let's begin with this third condition, right? If P weren't true, S wouldn't believe that P. Well, take the case of looking at the clock in the morning, right? So P is the belief it is 8 o'clock in the morning. So if it weren't 8 o'clock, you wouldn't believe that it's 8 o'clock. But this is false. If you had woken up 1 hour earlier and looked at the clock, it would have displayed 8 o'clock, and you would have formed the belief that it's 8 o'clock. If you'd woken up 1 hour later, you'd have formed the belief that it's 8 o'clock. So the method by which you're using to form your belief, looking at a clock, which, as it happened, has stopped, would, in different circumstances, lead you to form false beliefs. Now, these two conditions, conditions 3 and 4, are counterfactuals. The standard way that we analyze counterfactuals is in terms of possible worlds. So the counterfactual, if P had been, then Q would have been. That's true just in case in the closest possible worlds in which P is true, Q is true, right? So when we say if P weren't true, S wouldn't believe that P. Well, what we have to do is we have to, in order to analyze that counterfactual, we have to look at the closest possible worlds in which P is not true, and then we see what happens, right? Does S believe that P in those worlds, right? So we basically select the closest worlds where the antecedent is satisfied, and then see if the consequent is also true in those worlds. So compare the counterfactual, if you had dropped the glass, it would have shattered. So when evaluating this, we consider those worlds in which you drop the glass, right? So, and then we just ask, well, what happens? And not just any world is going to do here, because obviously, there are worlds, we might say, well, what about worlds in which God exists and then just decides to perform a miracle that saves the glass from shattering? What about worlds in which quantum fluctuations spontaneously turn the ground into sponge so that the glass bounces rather than shatters? What about worlds where the laws of physics spontaneously change so that the glass becomes durable rather than fragile? These are all possible worlds, sure, but the argument would be that these are distant worlds. These are worlds very different from our own world, so they're not relevant. When we take this counterfactual, if you had dropped the glass, it would have shattered. What we do is we consider worlds that are as close to our own as possible. So they have the same laws, the same history, things have developed the same way, up to the point where I'm holding the glass, and then we change that so that I drop the glass, and then see what happens. And in those worlds, the glass hits the floor and it breaks. And that's what makes the counterfactual true. So, applying this to condition 3, right, we imagine worlds like ours where P is not true. So worlds like ours where it isn't 8 o'clock, but we hold everything else fixed. What happens in those worlds? Well, I get up, I look at the clock, and I form the belief that it is 8 o'clock, because my belief is based on what the clock says. So in those worlds, my belief is false, and therefore this third condition, if P weren't true, S wouldn't believe that P, is not satisfied in this case. Now, Nozick points out that this third condition alone is not sufficient for a satisfactory account of knowledge. Consider a person who is a brain in a vat, who is brought to believe by direct stimulation of her brain that she is a brain in a vat, right? So like the evil neuroscientists manipulate her brain just in such a way so as to produce the belief, I am a brain in a vat. So she has a true belief. But does she know that she's a brain in a vat? Well, it seems like she doesn't. But notice that if she weren't in the vat, so if P weren't true, she wouldn't believe that she's in the vat. So she wouldn't believe that P. So that satisfies condition number 3. So another condition is required. Now Nozick says, look, what's going wrong with this person in the vat is that the operators of the vat could have produced pretty much any belief. I mean, they decided to induce in her a true belief, the true belief that she is in the vat, but they could just as well have decided to induce in her any number of false beliefs instead, such as that she really has a body and lives in a world like ours. So her belief is not sensitive to the facts. In order to know that P, your belief that P needs to be sensitive to P's truth. And this gives us the fourth condition, which is if P were true, S would believe that P. Now, the way it's stated, that might seem a little odd because, of course, we're stipulating that S does, in fact, have a true belief. So, we're saying, well, if P were true, then blah, blah, blah. But then, hang on, P is true. Well, the point here is that we consider not just the actual world where P is true, we also consider close alternative worlds where P is true. The closest alternative worlds where P is true have to be such that S continues to believe that P. So, suppose that S is a brain in a vat and is stimulated to form the belief that she's a brain in a vat. Well, there's a very close world in which S is a brain in a vat, but where the scientists instead choose to give her a different belief. They choose to deceive her and make her believe that she's not a brain in a vat. In that world, S would no longer believe the truth. So S, in the actual world, although she has a true belief, she doesn't know, she doesn't have knowledge. So, I mean, the general idea of this is that conditions 3 and 4 impose a kind of sensitivity condition on knowledge. In order for my belief that P to count as knowledge, it must be that my belief is not just true, but sensitive to the truth. So if things had been such that P is false, then I wouldn't believe that P. If things had been such that P is true, then I would still believe that P. So again, this is the account, right? S knows that P just in case P is true. S believes that P. If P weren't true, S wouldn't believe it. If P were true, S would believe it. It is true that P, and she believes it. And so, to quote Nozick, if it weren't true, she wouldn't believe it. If it were true, she would believe it. When these conditions hold, we say that your belief tracks the truth. So to have knowledge is to have a belief that tracks the truth. It tracks the truth because, basically your belief like matches what the truth is in these different possible situations, and that's what it is to have knowledge. Now, I should note, Nozick's account is slightly more complex than this. There are sort of bells and whistles that he adds to it, but this communicates the basic idea. Now, there is, however, a potentially maybe more serious snag with this account, which is posed by knowledge of necessary truths, such as knowledge of mathematics. We usually think that some truths are necessary, so they could not have been otherwise. They hold in all possible worlds. It's true in all possible worlds that 2 plus 2 equals 4, for example. Okay, but now consider again condition 3. If P weren't true, S wouldn't believe that P. We evaluate this by considering the closest possible worlds in which P is false. The trouble is that when P is a necessary truth, there are no possible worlds in which P is false. So for 2 plus 2 equals 4, there are no worlds in which it is true, in which it is false, that 2 plus 2 equals 4. So this condition is inapplicable to knowledge of necessary truths. Nozick, he says, though, this isn't really a problem, and in fact he thinks that this yields an adequate analysis of necessary truths. Remember, the basic idea of Nozick's account is that knowledge is a matter of being sensitive to the truth. You know that P when you would truly believe that P, and you wouldn't falsely believe that P. Now, when P is a necessary truth, it makes no sense to check whether you would falsely believe it. There's no way that you could falsely believe it because there's no way it could be false. So this third condition, the point of this third condition is to check that you wouldn't falsely believe that P. And where P is a necessary truth, that's no longer relevant. So for necessary truths, we just eliminate condition 3. So yeah, suppose that I use some method of mathematical proof to arrive at some mathematical belief. In the closest worlds in which I use that same method, and where I'm equally attentive and careful in my reasoning, I will arrive at the same belief. So condition 4 is satisfied, right? If P were true, I would still believe it. On the other hand, suppose I believe this mathematical claim simply on the basis of my parents' testimony, where my parents are not very good at mathematics. They tend to make mistakes about mathematics, even though in this particular case they're correct. They happen to be correct in this particular case, but they basically just got lucky. Well, then there will be many close worlds in which, my parents tell me that P is false. In those worlds, even if I'm just as attentive and careful at figuring out what their testimony is, I will be led to a false belief. And so in that situation, this fourth condition would not be satisfied. The result is I have knowledge of mathematical truths just in case I'm using reliable methods for arriving at mathematical beliefs, which Nozick says is the right result. Nozick's theory, it's also worth noting, is an externalist theory. I have talked about externalist responses to skepticism in more detail, so see my videos, Skepticism versus Externalism. I'll link that in the comments. But, okay, so externalism, internalism. Well, the basic distinction is this. For internalists, whether a true belief counts as knowledge is going to be determined by factors that are internal to the person. It's going to be determined by the believer's internal states. It will be a matter of the experiences or the reasons that the believer has for their belief. A person has knowledge only if they are, or at least can be, aware of the reasons that support their belief. By contrast, externalists hold that whether a belief counts as knowledge is going to be determined by factors external to the person who holds the belief. So a person may have knowledge even if they are not or cannot be aware of the reasons that support the belief, or the even if they can't be aware of why it counts as knowledge. The third and fourth conditions of Nozick's account are external in this sense. For Nozick, knowledge is not a matter of what's going on in your head. It's a matter of your beliefs being causally related to things in the world in the right kind of way. It's a matter of your beliefs tracking the facts. There's no guarantee that you will ever be able to tell whether your beliefs track the facts. Now, of course, we can hope that we will be in a position to verify that our beliefs track the facts. But even if we're not, we still have knowledge, right? As long as our beliefs track the facts, we have knowledge, even if we can never tell that our beliefs track the facts. You might already notice that this is relevant to skepticism, so I guess that makes a good segue. But before that, I have a quick advert, because I have a Patreon. If you want to support the channel, you can sign up to that, and there are lots of bonus videos available there where I give further thoughts on the topics that I talk about here. So, more of me available on the Patreon. Or if you just want to send a one-off donation, I have a PayPal. I offer private tutoring in philosophy, and I have a degree, master's and PhD, so I'm pretty well qualified to do that. And I have a Discord, which you can get the links for all of this in the description. Incidentally, even if you can't give me any money, give the video a like, give it a comment. It doesn't matter what it is. It's just it helps the algorithm, right? Any kind of engagement at all is good for the algorithm. So that will help the channel if that's all you can do. And with that said, let's turn to skepticism. Okay then, so the classic skeptical argument. The classic skeptical argument goes like this. We take H to be a skeptical hypothesis, such as the hypothesis that you are a brain in a vat. P is an ordinary, commonsensical claim about the external world, such as that you have hands. And then we say, if you don't know that not H, you don't know that P, you don't know that not H, therefore you don't know that P. So if you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know you have hands. You don't know you're not a brain in a vat, so you don't know you have hands. You can know various ordinary things about the external world only if you know that these skeptical scenarios are false, but we have no way to rule out those skeptical scenarios. All of my experiences are just as they would be if those skeptical scenarios were true. So Nozick wants to give a response to this. Now, I should say, one thing to bear in mind about what Nozick is going to say is that his aim is not so much to refute the skeptic, but rather just to explain how knowledge is possible given the logical possibility of skeptical scenarios. So if the skeptical argument is right, then we have no knowledge of the external world. And Nozick does want to, ultimately deny one of the premises of this argument, right? But his goal is to explain how knowledge is possible. And crucially, this explanation might well appeal to claims that the skeptic herself would not grant. So Nozick doesn't expect that his response will persuade the skeptic to change her mind. If you're already a skeptic, if you already have suspended judgment about whether there is an external world and all of that, then actually nothing Nozick says is going to move you. You're probably not going to be satisfied with Nozick's response. But he's not really trying to convince you. He's saying, well, for those of us who do think knowledge is possible, for those of us who deny the conclusion of this argument, right, what's the most plausible way of denying one of the premises? Like how can we show that knowledge is possible for those of us who do believe that we have knowledge? So with that said, with that sort of limitation explained, let's see what Nozick has to say. Now, initially, you might think that Nozick's account of knowledge is actually quite friendly to skepticism, because one way that we can construe skeptical hypotheses is that they're designed to challenge the third condition on knowledge, Nozick's third condition. So remember, if P weren't true, S wouldn't believe that P. Well, skeptical hypotheses attempt to show, in contrast to this condition, that for our common sense claims at least, even if those claims were false, we would still believe them. So take the brain in the vat scenario. By stipulation, the brain in the vat has exactly the same experiences that I do, at least like from the inside, as it were. The brain in the vat can't distinguish being a brain in a vat from my experiences. So in this scenario, P is false, right? If I were a brain in a vat, I wouldn't have hands. It would be false that I have hands. But since my experiences are phenomenally indistinguishable, I would still believe that I have hands. I would have exactly the same beliefs that the non-envattered version of me has. So for the belief I have hands, it would appear as if condition 3 is not satisfied, and so by Nozick's criteria, this doesn't count as knowledge. And the same is going to go for all of my other beliefs about the external world. It looks like all my beliefs about the external world fail condition 3. Well, that's how it might initially appear, but we have to be cautious here. The thing is that the existence of possible situations where S believes that P, even though P is false, that's not actually in conflict with condition 3. Remember, counterfactuals are evaluated by considering the closest possible worlds in which the antecedent is satisfied. So when we say, if P weren't true, S would still believe that P, we have to look at the closest worlds in which P isn't true. So condition 3 does not talk about all possible situations in which P is false, only the closest situations in which P is false. And the worlds that are described in skeptical hypotheses are not among the closest worlds. They are very different indeed from the actual world. In the actual world, I have a body, I interact with other people, I live in I'm surrounded by material objects and so on. In the brain in the vat hypothesis, my surroundings are completely different. So the brain in the vat hypothesis describes a very distant possible world, and therefore it's not relevant to condition 3. So what would be an example of a close world in which P is false? Well, okay, so P here is the proposition I have hands. So we're considering a close world in which it's false that I have hands. Well, let's say a world in which I had a car accident earlier today, and as a result I lost my hands. Well, in that world, when I wake up in the hospital and I see stumps on the ends of my arms, I don't continue to believe that I have hands. Instead, I think, oh no, I've lost my hands. So we have to imagine that this is a world in which I lose my hands, but then we try to hold fixed as much as possible of everything else. So in particular, my senses still function the same way. If I were to lose my hands while my senses were still working the same, well, I'd be aware of it. Now, I mean, obviously there's a lot of work being done by this notion of a closest possible world. We'll come back to that. But let's park that for now. With that said then, my belief that I have hands does in fact satisfy condition 3. Indeed, it satisfies all the conditions because it is true that I have hands. I believe that I have hands. If I didn't have hands, I wouldn't believe that I have hands. And if I did have hands, I would believe that I have hands. Now, I noted Nozick's goal is not to refute the skeptic, and hopefully it's clear why this is. If you're a skeptic, then you do not believe that you have hands. You suspend judgment about whether you have hands or are a handless brain in a vat or any other number of possibilities. But in that case, you're going to say, well, for all I can tell, I already am a brain in a vat. So I'm not entitled to assume that worlds in which I'm a brain in a vat are distant from the actual world or anything like that. So, again, Nozick is assuming that we have this knowledge and just trying to explain how that's possible. But, okay, there's an interesting wrinkle here, which is, so I know I have hands on Nozick's account, fair enough. Do I know that I'm not a brain in a vat? Well, actually, no. I don't know that, at least not according to Nozick. So here's the thing, right? Again, the issue here is really with condition number 3. So in order for me to know that I'm not a brain in a vat, it must be the case that, per condition 3, if it weren't true that I'm not a brain in a vat, I wouldn't believe that I'm not a brain in a vat. Okay, there's lots of negations here. So, but what that's saying is, if I were a brain in a vat, I wouldn't believe that I'm not a brain in a vat. But in contrast to this, actually, if I were a brain in a vat, I would still believe that I'm not a brain in a vat. This is just the nature of these skeptical hypotheses. They are chosen specifically so that if they were true, all of your experiences would be indistinguishable from the way that they are now. So on this analysis, actually, I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. I don't know that I'm not being deceived. Because again, right, if I were a brain in a vat, so we imagine a world in which I am a brain in a vat. Okay, does the belief I'm not a brain in a vat track the facts? Well, we now have to consider a world in which I am a brain in a vat, and do I believe in that world that I am a brain in a vat? Well, no, because the way that the scenario is specified is that I have exactly the same experiences. So I will form the same belief, right? I will form the belief that I'm not a brain in a vat. So the belief I'm not a brain in a vat does not track the truth. Now, according to Nozick, this is actually a virtue of his account. And the reason why is because it explains basically why skepticism has seemed so compelling, and he takes this to be an important criteria for a response to skepticism. Skeptical arguments have long puzzled philosophers, and they are powerful. I mean, even if ultimately you disagree with them, they have a lot of just psychological force. And so when we respond to skepticism, we want to show not just where those arguments go wrong, but why it is that people are so attracted to skepticism. And so Nozick says, well, the belief I have hands, that satisfies conditions 1 to 4, so it counts as knowledge. But the belief I'm not a brain in a vat, that fails to satisfy condition 3, so that does not count as knowledge. And actually that explains why this sort of skeptical scenario is so compelling. We really, I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat, just as the skeptic says. So Nozick denies premise 1, the first premise of the skeptical argument. If you don't know that not H, you don't know that P. If you don't know you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know you have hands. Nozick denies that, but he affirms premise 2, which is you don't know you're not a brain in a vat. We can't know that these skeptical hypotheses are false, but this is no obstacle to our having ordinary knowledge of the external world. So that is the the account of skepticism. Now, you might be feeling there's something a little bit fishy about this. So let's explore this a little bit further. A crucial feature of Nozick's account is that it denies a particular kind of closure principle. It denies that knowledge is closed under known logical implication. So here's the principle. If S knows that P and S knows that P entails Q, then on this basis alone, S can know that Q. This is called closure because basically we have some propositions that are known, and we then perform this operation of logical inference on those propositions, and then according to this principle we just end up with more propositions that are known. Logical implication takes us from knowledge to more knowledge. We never go from knowledge to something that isn't knowledge, as long as we're dealing with like logical entailment. So knowledge is closed under known logical implication. Now, we can debate the exact form of this principle, but most philosophers endorse some sort of closure principle along these lines. And I mean, I think it's easy to see why. It's a pretty, it's a pretty intuitive principle. I mean, like, I know I have hands. Okay, we're assuming that this is true. Let's assume I know I have hands. I also know that if I have hands, I'm not a handless brain in a vat. So, given this, it seems a very short step to the claim that I know I'm not a handless brain in a vat. And that's the closure. That step involves the closure principle. And it seems pretty plausible. But on Nozick's view, knowledge is not closed under known logical implication. Nozick denies this principle, and this is what allows him to deny premise 1 of the skeptical argument. So, why exactly does this principle fail for Nozick? Well, we're considering again condition number 3. So we're going to suppose that S has the belief that P, and P satisfies condition 3. If P weren't true, S wouldn't believe that P. Now, the general idea here is, it may well be that S's belief satisfies condition 3, and it may well be that P logically entails Q, and indeed that S knows that P logically entails Q, but S's belief that Q does not satisfy condition 3. So if Q were true, S wouldn't believe that Q. And the reason, so what's happening here is that, like, it may be that S's belief that P is dependent on the truth of P, and S knows that P entails Q, but S's belief that Q is not dependent on the truth of Q. I mean, basically, when we say if P weren't true, S wouldn't believe that P, we're asking what S would believe if P weren't true. Whereas when we say if Q weren't true, S wouldn't believe that Q, we're asking what S would believe if Q weren't true, and those are different questions. They're different questions even when P entails Q. Now, I've said that this is all quite abstract so far, so let's take a specific example. Nozick says, well, let's consider this sort of case, right? Suppose that P is, I am sitting in a chair in England, and Q is, I am not a brain in a vat on Alpha Centauri. Clearly, P entails Q. If I'm sitting in a chair in England, I can't be a brain in a vat on Alpha Centauri. And of course, I know this. I know that P entails Q. Let's apply this to condition number 3. If P were false, what would be the case? Well, maybe I'd be lying down in England, or I'd be walking in England, or maybe I'd be in another country, sitting down in another country, depending on which part of the counterfactual we take as the relevant thing to vary. But in all these cases, condition 3 is satisfied. If I were not sitting in a chair in England, I wouldn't believe that I was sitting in a chair in England. Instead, I would believe that I was walking in England, or that I was lying down in England, or that I was sitting in France, or whatever the case may be. By contrast, if Q were false, what would be the case? Well, I would be a brain in a vat on Alpha Centauri. And in this case, I would still believe that I'm not a brain in a vat on Alpha Centauri. I would still believe that I'd still believe that I'm sitting in a chair in England. So although P entails Q, what it is that I would believe in these counterfactual situations is very different indeed. And so this is such that I do track the truth about whether I'm sitting in a chair in England, but I don't track the truth about whether I'm a brain in a vat on Alpha Centauri. So I know that P, I don't know that Q, even though P entails Q. And I mean, I suppose, this sort of, again, you have to remember, Nozick's theory is externalist, right? So, there's something kind of odd about saying, well, I know that P, like I have it in my head. It's like, I know that P entails Q. Surely I would come to know that Q. But again, like what's happening in your head isn't really what's relevant here. What's relevant is the sort of counterfactual dependence of your belief on things in the world. Nozick actually makes quite an interesting point about closure, which is that he says there's a sort of tension in the skeptical argument, because premise 1 of the skeptic's argument assumes closure. Remember, premise 1 is, if you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, you don't know you have hands. And so that's going to be applying this closure principle. Premise 2 of the skeptical argument, on the other hand, is you don't know you're not a brain in a vat. But why? What's the case for this? Well, it looks like the reason is that if you were a brain in a vat, you would still believe that you weren't. And that's why you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat. So what deprives us of knowledge here, as the skeptic sees it, is precisely the fact that our belief fails to vary appropriately with the facts. The belief, I am not a brain in a vat, doesn't vary with the facts. Because if I was a brain in a vat, I'd still believe that I wasn't. So Nozick says that in defending premise 2, the skeptic has to agree that in order for something to count as knowledge, the belief must vary with the truth of what is believed. But if knowledge involves the belief varying with the facts in this kind of way, then closure under known logical implication is false. So Nozick says part of the skeptic's argument rests on the closure principle, while another part of the skeptic's argument depends on denying the closure principle. So Nozick summarizes, and I quote, "According to our view, he, the skeptic, is right when he holds that knowledge involves such variation, and so concludes that we don't know, for example, that we are not brains in vats. But he is wrong when he assumes that knowledge is closed under known logical implication and concludes that we hardly know anything." So, yes, there we go. Nozick embraces the denial of closure. For many philosophers, however, this is a serious cost of his theory because, well, closure is an extremely plausible principle. And I mean, one way to really kind of bring out this plausibility has been that, so denying closure commits us to so-called abominable conjunctions. Okay, so here's an example of this. Nozick has to affirm both of these things. He has to say, I know that I have hands, and I don't know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. That seems very strange. That seems almost outright paradoxical. Indeed, notice that not handless is just another way to express has hands. So we could just put this as follows. We could say, so Nozick has to affirm, I know I'm not handless, and I don't know that I'm not a handless brain in a vat. And this almost starts to look outright contradictory, right? I know I'm not handless, but I don't know that I'm not this specific way of being handless. But surely if I know that I'm not handless, then I know that I'm not any way of being handless. That's just what it is to know that I'm not handless, isn't it? So consider all of the possible ways of being handless, right? I lose my hands in a car accident. I accidentally cut off my hands after dropping a chainsaw. I'm a handless brain in a vat, etc., etc. What it is to know that I'm not handless is to know that none of these scenarios obtain, surely. It's to know that I'm not any way of being handless. Similarly, I know that I'm not in a vat. How do I know that I'm not in a vat? Well, because it's true that I'm not in a vat, and in the closest worlds where I am in a vat, I believe I'm in a vat. Say, a world where somebody builds a big vat around my body. I'm going to believe that I'm in a vat in that world. Yeah, in the closest worlds where I'm not in a vat, and then in the closest worlds where I'm not in a vat, I believe I'm not in a vat. So the belief I am not in a vat satisfies Nozick's condition for knowledge. But then Nozick has to affirm the following. I know that I'm not in a vat, but I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Ooh, that seems dodgy, right? I know I'm not in a vat, but I don't know that I'm not this specific way of being in a vat. But surely if I know I'm not in a vat, I know I'm not any way of being in a vat. So, yes, these are the abominable conjunctions. They are very uncomfortable things to have to assert, and it looks like Nozick has to assert them. Now, one response to this is to say, well, strictly speaking, these abominable conjunctions are true. And so, yes, like we just grant them. But then we say that what's bizarre about them, what's uncomfortable about them, is that uttering these conjunctions would in some way violate ordinary conversational norms. So here's an analogy. Consider the term empty. When we use this term, we usually implicitly restrict it to a particular domain of objects. For instance, I might say that the fridge is empty. And what I mean is the fridge contains no food. There's nothing to eat in the fridge. At the same time, the fridge contains shelves and a temperature dial and dust. It's still true that the fridge is empty in the sense that I intend, because, of course, I'm talking about food specifically. But then notice that, strictly speaking, it would be true to say the fridge is empty and the fridge contains shelves. And that kind of seems like an abominable conjunction. Now, of course, so this is the sort of sketch of an idea, but how to develop this response in detail is another matter. I mean, in the case of a term like empty, we can pretty straightforwardly account for what's going on by noting that what's happening with standard uses of this term is that we're implicitly quantifying over a restricted domain. And the trouble with a sentence like the fridge is empty and the fridge contains shelves is that it shifts the domain from food in the first conjunct to all physical objects in the second conjunct. And you kind of shouldn't do that in the middle. You shouldn't like shift the domain of quantification in the middle of a sentence. So it's not surprising then that when we say the fridge is empty and the fridge contains shelves, it seems weird. But once you keep in mind the shift in the domain of quantification, the conjunction, it no longer seems abominable, right? Like once you keep in mind that when I say the fridge is empty, I just mean it has no food, it's no longer particularly weird to say the fridge is empty and the fridge contains shelves. Uh, Now, the trouble is that in the case of these epistemic abominable conjunctions, it's really not so obvious what the source of the conflict is. Why? Okay, yeah. Why does this happen? What's going on there? And notice that even once we've explained how the term knowledge is to be understood, the epistemic conjunctions still seem deeply bizarre. I mean, I just explained Nozick's theory of knowledge in detail, and I showed why it is that on that theory of knowledge we end up having to affirm these abominable conjunctions. But even with that explanation, it still looks like we're saying something completely absurd. So this has been, I think, yeah, this is one of the central problems, as most philosophers see it, with an account like Nozick's. So, okay, another couple of difficulties. So, another problem for Nozick's account is that arguably it can't capture much of our everyday knowledge. In particular, it runs into trouble with certain cases of inductive knowledge. Here's an example from Jonathan Vogel. So 60 golfers are playing a tournament which contains a particularly difficult hole known as the Heartbreaker. Very few people are able to get a hole-in-one on the Heartbreaker, and you assume, correctly as it turns out, that not all 60 players will get a hole-in-one on the Heartbreaker. This looks like a perfectly reasonable case of inductive knowledge, if anything is. But how does this fare with Nozick's conditions? So, you know, some players will fail to score a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker. So it's true that some players fail to score a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker. You believe that some players fail to score a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker. If it weren't true that they would fail to score a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker, you wouldn't believe it. And if it were true that they failed to score a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker, you would believe it. Trouble here arises for the third condition. If it weren't true that some players failed to get a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker, you wouldn't believe it. So we have to consider the closest possible worlds in which this isn't true. So the closest possible worlds in which all 60 players do score a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker. What do you believe in those worlds? Well, in those worlds, you know, it looks like the reason why they score a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker is they just get lucky. I mean, you know, it's improbable, but improbable things happen. Okay, so in those worlds, you have exactly the same evidence as in the actual world. So surely you would continue to expect that some would fail to get a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker. Even in those worlds, that would be the reasonable thing to expect, given that, you know, they just end up getting very, very lucky. But what that means is, of course, is that when you have the belief some players will fail to get a hole-in-one in the Heartbreaker in the actual world, even though that belief is true, it's not knowledge, because it doesn't. It fails to satisfy this third condition. Here's a more everyday example. Let's say you go to the tap, pour yourself a cup of water. You expect that this water will quench your thirst and not poison you. The water is safe to drink. So, it's true that the water is safe to drink. You believe the water is safe to drink. If it weren't true that the water is safe to drink, you wouldn't believe it. If it were true that the water is safe to drink, you would believe it. Again, this third condition poses some challenges, because consider the closest possible world in which the water is not safe to drink. Well, what's going on in that world? Why is it not safe to drink? Well, maybe some terrorist has intentionally poisoned the water supply in a terrorist act, or maybe some error has been made by the water companies, or maybe the pipes to your house were not installed correctly and they've corroded in some way. Well, in those worlds, it looks like you have, again, exactly the same evidence as in the actual world, so you will still believe that the water is safe to drink. So your belief that the water is safe to drink fails to satisfy this third condition. Now, I mean, look, there is an obvious response to these sorts of cases, which is, well, actually, you know, we're not considering the closest possible world here. So we're not considering the closest possible world in which the water is not safe to drink. Maybe the closest possible world in which the water is not safe to drink would be one in which the water is visibly different from ordinary water, or it would be one in which you are aware that there has been some sort of problem, so you believe the water is not safe to drink. Like, if there has been a terrorist attack or an error made by the water company or whatever, this would have been reported, so you would know not to drink the water. You know, you can massage the worlds in this kind of way. But of course, this raises another worry about Nozick's account, which is, well, just how exactly do we specify what counts as the closest possible world? There are general problems with evaluating counterfactuals, and I've discussed this in my video, Are All Counterfactuals False?, which I will link in the comments. But let's consider again the proposition, I have hands. In the closest possible worlds in which this proposition is false, I don't believe it. Okay, consider the world in which I had a car accident earlier today, I lost my hands. In that world, I no longer believe that I have hands. But, well, really? I mean, surely there are all sorts of things that could have happened after that accident. Maybe, for instance, I also suffer some sort of brain damage, which leads me to believe that I do still have hands. Maybe I form the stubborn belief that I have hands. There is a similar psychological phenomenon where people with brain damage that blinds them insist that they can see. Or maybe I end up hallucinating that I have hands or something like that. Or maybe I'm just like, in the hospital and I can't see my hands, I'm laying in bed and I have the sort of phantom limb syndrome or something that makes me feel like I do have hands there. Why shouldn't these worlds count as among the close ones? Indeed, in some respects, these worlds seem to be closer than the world in which my belief is different, right? At least with respect to what I believe, these worlds are closer. A world where I continue to believe that I have hands is more similar to the actual world with respect to what I believe. In any case, yeah, if we select those worlds in which I have a car accident and lose my hands, well, some of those worlds are worlds where I believe I have no hands, but it looks quite plausible that some of those worlds are worlds where I believe that I do have hands. I continue to hold the same belief. And so we might think this is a problem. Like, there isn't any determinate sort of fact about like what's going to follow. So like, because there's just a collection of worlds where like different things follow from my losing my hands. And this problem becomes particularly vicious, I think, when we consider more complex forms of knowledge. So let's take, for instance, my belief that species evolved by natural selection. And we'd probably want, we'd normally want to say, okay, that's a classic case of like scientific knowledge. I mean, it's one of the most well-confirmed scientific theories we have. So consider the counterfactual. If it weren't true that species evolved by natural selection, I wouldn't believe it. Well, we need to consider those worlds closest to ours in which modern evolutionary theory is false. Species did not evolve by natural selection. But, I mean, one immediate issue here is there are many alternatives to modern evolutionary theory. There are, just indefinite alternatives, right? But, like, what are we dealing with here? Are we dealing with worlds in which species were created by God? Worlds in which there is Lamarckian evolution? Worlds where new species arrives through abrupt transformations, as in the saltational theories of evolution? It's far from clear what we would believe in any of these worlds. So one thing we might say, well, look, if natural selection did not occur, then the methods used by scientists would lead them to develop alternative theories. And so we would not accept evolution by natural selection. So in the closest worlds without natural selection, scientists would develop alternative theories, not natural selection, so we do not believe natural selection. So in that case, condition 3 is vindicated. But then, we know that scientists historically have accepted false theories. Even if science is a reliable method, it doesn't guarantee the truth. And remember, when figuring out the closest possible world, we have to hold fixed as much as possible. So we might say, well, the closest possible worlds where natural selection did not occur would be worlds in which scientists happened to gather similar evidence that we have, in which science developed in a similar way that our science did. In those worlds, we would still believe that species developed through natural selection. The problem here is that it looks like we can tell the story pretty much any way we like. There doesn't seem to be any determinate fact to the matter what I would believe had natural selection not occurred. It's just a matter of how we're choosing to tell the story and which things we're choosing to hold fixed. But in that case, it's not that Nozick's account gives us a surprising answer about whether my belief counts as knowledge. It doesn't seem to give us any answer at all. There's just no fact of the matter, one way or the other. And so this may well be another problem. Okay, well, that was an introduction to Nozick's truth tracking theory. I hope you found that interesting, and that's all for now. Goodbye, everybody.